to start off with maybe a quick bio, and then from there we'll get right into your book.
Okay. Well, about 15 years ago, when I was back in college, I was taking a Western Civilization class, and we got to the Crusades, and I came across a short, very, very short reference to the Knights Templar that mentioned that they had owned half of the farmable land in Europe, and they had developed the banking system and had agents in every royal court in Europe at the time, and there was about a pair, just 2 or 3 lines devoted to them. So I started thinking, wait a minute, there should be a little bit more on these guys than that. So I started doing research into the Templars and kind of started a life path on investigations into the esoteric and into historical mystery in general. I became as part of my research, I found Freemasonry, became a Mason, and had achieved the 32nd degree of the Scottish Rite. And about in 2006, I started chronicling some of my investigations and some things in a blog and website called Grail Seekers, which can be found at on Blogger and at www.grailseekers.com.
Yeah.
And was working a corporate job for 11 years, and this past September I decided to give it all up and do what I enjoy doing, which is writing and investigating, and Skullduggery is my first book. Hopefully one of many. So,
yeah,
kind of a big scary leap there, but I'm doing what I love. I hate being miserable, so here I am.
Exactly. And I believe that is one of the purposes of life, is to live your life doing what you love, and doing what you love as a career, of course.
Amen.
Yes, sir.
It takes a little while to figure that out. It takes a little faith to do it, but I can't describe how much happier I am now doing what I'm doing now. So I appreciate you having me on tonight, too.
Oh, anytime, because I actually heard your shows with Rick Osmond, who I have been blessed to have conversations with.
Oh, yeah, Rick is
a very good man. Yes, I heard your shows on there, and I was fascinated, to say the least. And I wanted to bring a few of my friends on. We have a few of my guests co-hosts we bring on. I have my friend Melchizedek on the line, I think. Let me see if this... Yes, Melchizedek, are you there?
How you doing, Brother Stephen?
I am doing swell, brother. How you doing, Melchizedek?
I'm doing all right. Usually not off on Sunday nights, but I had a grandmother pass away. Today was viewing, tomorrow's the funeral, so I had a couple days off.
Sorry to hear about that, but wow, it's almost a blessing in disguise for the show, at least. But I'm very sorry to hear about that, man.
It's all right.
So, get to see the description on the showcase here, Mel?
Yes, indeed.
Actually, Brian, I think Melchizedek would be a perfect person to help co-host the show today, and I think I'm blessed to have him aboard because he is very informative and definitely has studied the Freemasons and the Templars and the ancient history. But until we get to that, let's dive right into your book, and that's Skullduggery, 45 True Tales of Disturbing the Dead. Let's get into that and what compelled you to write a book about grave robberies.
Well, I was doing a interview with Patrice Chaplin, who's Charlie Chaplin's daughter-in-law, in November of 2007. Her publicist had gotten in touch with me to do a piece on her book, City of Secrets, where she chronicled some esoteric experiences she had in Spain when she was a young girl and what her theory of what the Holy Grail was. So I was fortunate enough to talk to her, and in doing some back research on her and on the Chaplin family, I came across the story of Charlie Chaplin's body being stolen for extortion purposes in 1977, about 3 months after he died. So I started doing a little more research on this and found out that it wasn't just Chaplin that this had happened to. I'd known about, medical grave robberies back in the 1800s, which I get into a little bit in the book. But there are a ton of famous people and not so famous people that have had their bodies stolen for all sorts of purposes. But the stories were really fascinating because they turn into a hidden history. I mean, the way people's lives are chronicled, they end with the grave. And most biographies you pick up of Groucho Marx or Chaplin or Thomas Paine end with him dying. Well, that's not the end of these people's stories. They continue on after the grave. And some of these stories have become folklore over the years, and some have never really been told satisfactorily. So I decided that it was probably time that hidden history come out.
Indeed. There are actually a few people that have decided, as you put in words, that hidden, quote-unquote, history come out. And as a matter of fact, history may be the incorrect word. It's a good phrase because everybody knows what his story is, but our story or Earth's story or human story may be a little bit better example of that instead of what the winner writes as the story.
Exactly. I mean, and there's, I think it sounds like y'all are savvy enough to understand that there's a lot that's been left out of the Septic Chronicles.
Yes, indeed.
Exactly. Not only do we know and have studied and researched, but there are quite a few people out there that actually their lineages go back quite far into history, and actually things aren't always passed in books. There's a lot of knowledge, like the Aboriginals do, that are passed in oral tradition. And when they're passed in oral tradition, there are things that validate this oral tradition. So a lot of the things that these truth seekers look for, they're not going to find the answers to because they don't have the oral traditions. The mouthpieces that are around right now to spit this oral tradition to the masses are the ones that have received it through the generations. And it kept quiet for a long time for a certain reason. And one thing that a lot of these truth seekers don't realize, and I keep putting them in a group called truth seekers, it's just the best way I can categorize a lot of people that research stuff, is they seem to think that the Illuminati are all Freemasons, and they're missing a big point in the message. All Freemasons are not Illuminatis. All Freemasons are not out to get everybody. A lot of the Freemasons know not what the material is that they even read.
It's certainly true. There's a lot of guys out there that, they are members of the lodge to be part of a tradition, and they want to be part of a tradition, and that's where Masonry ends for them. They're part of a fraternity, and that's great. I mean, we do a lot of good work. And then there's other guys like me that are out there that are interested more in understanding what the rules and the history are. And, we're all admonished as Masons to make it out of Masonry what we will. So, what's good enough for one guy, it might not be good enough for the other, or might not be their end purpose. So I agree with you. And as far as, us being part of the Illuminati or anything, if anybody had sat in on one of our building committees or trying to get a lodge picnic together, y'all would know that there's definitely somebody out there that can pull the strings of the world better than us. Getting one of those together is, hard enough.
It sounds quite strange when I say this, but I seem to think this a lot of times when I watch like YouTube videos or I hear these people talk like they know exactly what's going on. It's almost as if they're trying to bring about another Friday the 13th, another persecution of innocent people.
Yeah, and that's something else about Masonry that I firmly believe is Masonry does not direct anyone to do anything except lead a good moral life.
That's right.
Now, there are folks that do things of their own volition, or groups of people that do things that happen to be Masons, that make poor decisions or make, counterproductive decisions that happen to be Masons. And unfortunately, everyone gets on the bandwagon to think that, somebody at the Supreme Council in the 33rd degree in Washington has sent down this little piece of paper or an email to somebody and said, all right, tonight you guys are going to do X. And that's just not true. It doesn't work that way.
That's what a lot of people think, though. And it almost seems like there's a force behind it that's pushing this new Friday the 13th. And because they're pointing fingers in a direction that really, if anybody truly half-heartedly does any research into the Masons or any kind of lodge, any kind of society like that, and people call them secret societies, they're not really secret. I just have to put it there because anyone can join. You have to get a petition. That's about it. And it's open, basically.
Well, we do a crappy job of being a secret society when you can go in the phone book and look up my lodge's phone number. I mean, you can drive past my lodge, and there's no mistaking. I mean, there's this huge compass and square on the outside of Doric Lodge in Nashville. So the Grand Lodge is downtown, too, which is this beautiful marble structure that was built back in the 20s. That's, just a great building, but, it's adorned with Masonic symbols. So, we do a really bad job of hiding who we are.
Wow. Well, guys, I think that's a perfect disclaimer for our listeners because I notice a lot of the unaware of the Freemasonry and the work of the Templars really tend to judge who they consider to be Illuminati off the bat just because you're a Freemason. I noticed that on Blog Talk, so I believe that's a perfect disclaimer for Brian, and not to judge a person just because they're a Mason, along with doing your own discernment and research on the Masons, because I've seen that a lot, and people are quick to make judgment upon somebody who's a Mason. So that's for the listeners.
And also, a lot of these people, they study the quote-unquote Illuminati, but what they don't realize is by studying what they study, they themselves become what they study, the observer of the observed.
Exactly. So, she wanted to hold on to that one, Mel. I wanted to please hold on to all those questions you got stored in your mind right now, because I definitely wanted to knock out all the information about his book. So the book deals with a lot of different characters, a lot of different well-known people, celebrities. Did you actually start from the beginning, so to say, or maybe take it back to the ancients and then go forward? Because I did not get a chance to read the book, but I definitely will.
No, I didn't. What I tried to do is I tried to break up the different types of skullduggery, and that's the best term I've been able to come up for it, into different categories, like for scientific reasons or political reasons, cult reasons, religious reasons, and told 3 or 4 stories in each of those headings. Of course, the grave robbery goes back to past the ancient Egyptians, but we have
all the way back to the Sumerians, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, there's always been an easy target about the dead. And anyone that's
and what's funny about that, Brian, as I was thinking about this topic and wondering the validity of it, I was like, well, for the less unfortunate, grave robbing would probably be the first thing you would do. Or, basically in the ancients, people were starving. People might have been cannibalizing each other just to stay alive. So I would believe that would be a smart thing to do just to survive and maybe get some gold to trade off or whatnot. So I'm sure you tackled that subject a little bit.
A little bit, yeah. I mean, even in my own family history, I bring this up in my introduction, my grandmother told a story about some relative of ours, and I can't even, this was told to me once, maybe twice when I was a teenager. But some relative of ours that had died and been buried in the local cemetery there, out in the boonies of Tennessee where my grandparents lived. And there was some dispute in the family as to this person being buried with a wedding ring. And this was back during the Depression. And my grandmother would go into the, whys and wherefores of all the family stuff, which of course was lost on me as a young man. But she always ended the story with, and if they didn't go out and dig up his grave that night and steal that ring and rebury him, that ain't going to happen to me. But, yeah, I mean, it happens. Even at the beginning of December, the ex-president of Cyprus's body was stolen for possibly a political protest. I mean, so this stuff is in the headlines, this week.
Wow.
So, yeah.
It is definitely prevalent.
Yes, indeed.
So,
yeah,
so Brian, who would you like to start off, or how would you like to start off? Because I know you get into different sections and different reasons. What character would you like to start off? Because I like to definitely get into the book and let the people know about what's really going on in the book and the characters they can run into.
Well, some of the characters that you can run into are, and I'll pick one of my favorite ones here towards the end, William Ward, which kind of has a little Masonic tie-in too. But there was a plot to steal Elvis's body. Thomas Paine's body was stolen. Charlie Chaplin, Groucho Marx's ashes were stolen. Alexander the Great's body was stolen for political purposes. Emanuel Swinburne, who has a church that's named after him even today that Johnny Appleseed was a member of, his skull was stolen. I've got a chapter in there actually on the Skull and Bones Society, and not examining as much their ritual, but the validity of whether they could possess, the skulls of people like Che Guevara or Martin Buren, Geronimo, Pancho Villa, which they're all rumored to have in the tomb there at New Haven. Eva Peron. I mean, so there's once again a ton of famous people that I've written about, and some not so famous folks. An unfortunate 2-year-old girl's body was stolen in Connecticut just this summer. Who had I believe it was hydrocephalitis, where her brainstem didn't fully form, and somebody had stolen her body out of the grave and put it in a plastic bag and floated it down the Passaic River in New Jersey. I mean, so there are real tragic stories in there too, of people just like me, folks that live under the same circumstances that we do, and end up coming to truly tragic ends. But one of my favorite stories that I came across was that of William Ward. And he was a presidential candidate in the 1830s. And he actually ran on the anti-Masonic ticket against Andrew Jackson and lost. He also wrote the first definitive biography of Patrick Henry, that we get his speech from the House of Burgesses with the give me liberty or give me death speech.
Okay.
William Ward.
Wow.
Well, yeah. He was buried in the Congressional Cemetery in Washington, D.C., which Congressional Cemetery is kind of a fascinating little place in and of itself, because it is a privately owned cemetery that entered into kind of a public partnership back in the early days of the Republic. I'm thinking it was 1810, 1820, if I remember correctly, because one of the congressmen in Washington had died in office, and he was from Connecticut or Maine, and back then they really didn't do embalming like they do now, so his body could not be shipped back home. And the government was faced with the dilemma, what do we do with public officials that die in office in Washington? So they contracted with this small church cemetery, and Congressional Cemetery was formed. And over the years, a number of folks have been buried there that have been congressmen. A couple presidents are buried there. But William Wirt came to rest there. And one day along about 2004, the cemetery manager out there, a guy by the name of Bill Beck, got an odd phone call right around Christmas time. And it was a woman who asked him, "Do you know where William Wirt's skull is?" He said, "Well, I guess it's in his tomb where it should be." "Well, it's not." "Do you know about a grave robbery that happened at Congressional 18 years ago?" "No, ma'am, I don't." "Well, would you like William Wirt's skull back?" "Well, of course I would. If, it's supposed to be here, we want it back." Caller hangs up. Over the course of the next few weeks, this woman calls back a number of times. And they can't really exact any more information out of her. They can't hook up with her to try to find out whether she actually has an honest-to-goodness human skull or not. And they do some looking around Wirt's tomb, and there have been a lot of storm damage over the years, and unfortunately Congressional operates on a very shoestring budget. They do a lot of great work out there, but they're not publicly funded. I mean, they have to raise a lot of their own funds, and unfortunately a number of the graves that were in the same row as Wirt's had been plundered over the years. So they couldn't immediately ascertain without taking an archaeological team or a forensics team into his tomb to find out whether he was actually there or not. Well, they're trying to decide exactly what to do, and they get a call another couple weeks later from a Washington, D.C. councilman who says, "Do you guys have any interest in William Wirt's skull?" Which, of course, this perks up the cemetery manager's ears, who I'm sure is thinking, this has got to be some kind of running gag at this point. Turns out it's not. One of his constituents had given this councilman a small wooden box with gold lettering that said the Honorable William Wirt. And inside, I've got pictures of it in the book, but it looks like a purple velvet is lining the box and a human skull. The councilman tells, basically, I had a constituent that called me up that came by this, didn't know what to do with it. I said, "Drop by my office, I'll give Congressional a call, we'll get it all sorted out." Well, one thing leads to another, and Congressional can't get a team together to find out whether Wirt's skull's actually been stolen, and a year passes. And this councilman actually still has William Wirt's skull sitting on his desk. Finally, Congressional gets the money and the volunteers together to go into Wirt's tomb. And Wirt was not the only person buried in his crypt. There was his family members and a few of his descendants that were also buried there. I think the last was if I remember correctly, one of his great-grandchildren or great cousins that was an officer in the Civil War. But when they opened up the tomb, they saw that all the bones were scattered all throughout the tomb. Someone had obviously been in there. So they get in touch with the Smithsonian Institute, and a forensic anthropologist comes out, sorts out all the bones, and figures out, sure enough, William Wirt's skull is missing. So one of the people I interviewed for the book, a guy by the name of Patrick Crowley, who's on Congressional's board, actually went to this congressman or this city councilman office to pick up the skull and walked it from his offices down the street to the Smithsonian Institute. He said it was pretty surreal, walking down the streets of D.C. with a skull under his arm, in a wooden box, go figure. But anyway, they figure out that it is William Wirt's skull. And they start putting the pieces together because the councilman has gotten some bad press about this, and Congressional has too. But it turns out that a collector by the last name of Smith, who actually held the world's largest privately owned collection of Kennedy memorabilia, had died that year. And in his collection, somehow he had come across the skull of William Wirt.
Mm.
The person that gave it to the councilman was the person that appraised that collection. And the person, they still don't know who the mysterious caller was, but conjecture is, and according to Crowley, he believes that it was Smith's wife that called, trying to make things right after she had discovered that it was in the collection as well.
Wow.
Yeah. So anyway, they finally get all the bones together and get worked. You know, all
Ryan, how did they actually confirm that skull was? I think that's a good question for the listeners.
Yeah, what they did was you can match up a person's skull with the vertebra.
Okay.
Connecting the skull. Yeah.
There we go.
Yeah, that's a fairly straightforward process. The other way, of course, is DNA testing, which they didn't do. But the forensic anthropologist, and this I'm glad you that leads to the next part of the story, couldn't find the linking vertebra. Now, the bones from the crypt were in the same condition and seemed to be at the same density, you know, that type thing, as Lorch were in the tomb. So it was very evident that they were the same to an expert. But the 2 or 3 top vertebrates who give 110% certainty that was Lorch's skull. Well, he was digging around trying to find the vertebra in the tomb and came across the bones of an infant that had been buried there, had not been in that tomb more than 20 years. So somebody, probably around the time of the original grave robbery, had placed the infant's bone, or the infant, in there. D.C. police were called in, but they never found out the identity of that poor child or what happened to him. But anyway, thus about ends the story of William Wirt, except for a year or so afterwards, and nobody has satisfactorily explained this either. Crowley had told me that 2 men from Oklahoma had stopped by the Congressional Cemetery, very interested in what had happened with Wirt and the case, and were kind of hacked off because they had evidently had some requests for information, but Congressional was slow to give it to them, and had some words with Crowley and left in a huff. But who they were, what their purposes were, no one ever knows. They might have had something to do with the grave robbery. They might have had something to do with that small child that was in there. But that just kind of shows Wirt's story touches on a lot of the different elements in a lot of these stories. I mean, you've got behaviors of trophy hunting. The fact that, you know, you really wouldn't think that somebody's skull would be valuable.
Yeah.
Turns out it is.
I found that very interesting. I found that fact very interesting, and I can't imagine the type of person who would actually, you know, be interested in paying for skulls and whatnot, but I'm sure they're there because you have the hunter types.
Well, I mean, just once again, within the last 2 months, 2 of Galileo's finger bones were found that had been missing for, you know, 200 or 300 years. Those are going to be put on exhibit in the museum.
Amazing.
So, yeah, I mean, it's incredible. I mean, but you also have stories, too. You've got all these horrible stories of, you know, greed and avarice and extortion that go on, and just downright theft that go on. But you've also got a few stories in there that are really born out of love, if you can believe that. There was a gentleman in Key West in the 20s. Actually, I'm sorry, it was in the early 30s. He was a German immigrant who had left his wife and family to kind of restart his life in America. And he had a very common name, but once he got to Key West, he was the Baron von Kassel. He had 9 degrees and was a submarine commander in World War I, and, you know, was this very larger-than-life character and actually worked as a radiologist in Key West Hospital. Well, one of the patients that he treated was a young Cuban dancer who had tuberculosis. And at that time, tuberculosis was a death sentence. I mean, there were no antibiotics capable of treating them. This Von Kassel immediately fell in love with her. He had thought that she was the same woman that he'd been envisioning his entire life as his true love. Wooed and beseeched her to marry him. She wouldn't really have anything to do with him. Unfortunately, within a few months, she died. He tried to heal her, using all sorts of mad scientist concoctions, didn't work. Well, she ends up being buried, and he didn't have enough time to get a above-ground mausoleum together for her. In Key West, the water table is, about 3 inches away from the ground anyway. Yeah. So most of the crypt, or most of the burials are done above ground. Well, he actually paid for a crypt to be built for her. Kind of amazed her family because this old German guy was doing all this for him. And he would, after the crypt was built, he convinced the Key West authorities to exhume her body and put it in the crypt. And he held the only key to it. And he would go in every night into the crypt and talk to her and sing to her. Even had a telephone installed in one of the stories so she could call him. And eventually that got to be too much for him. So he stole the body from the crypt and put it in his home where they lived a proper life as man and wife for a number of years until the citizenry of Key West found out about it and he was arrested because of it. But her body was put on display, and he had gone to such great lengths to preserve it and kept it for like 6, 7, 8 years. They displayed it in one of the funeral homes in Key West, which I've long before I thought about doing the book, I'd done a tour of Key West and been told this story while wandering around the city. But in one of the funeral homes, they had 3,000 or 4,000 people that came by to see her body. I mean, this morbid fascination with the story. But Von Kassel was found, he wasn't found insane by the courts. He was very lucid. He stood trial for what he'd done and got off on a number of the accounts that were levied against him because the statute of limitations had run out. But he did this because he loved this woman. In our American view, that's pretty weird. But
obsessive.
Very obsessive. But in the South American and European views of that, it's a true token of everlasting love. Anyway, to make a long story short about Von Kassel and wrap that up, supposedly after he got out of Dutch with the local authorities, he had it out with the remaining family members of the poor Cuban dancer, and they basically said, listen, we're going to bury her in a undisclosed spot where you can never get to her again. The night after Von Kassel had left Key West forever, mysteriously, Maria's tomb exploded. No one knows why. They don't know whether it was the family that blew it up because they couldn't stand the sight of it and the stigma of Von Kassel, or Von Kassel had blown it up simply because he couldn't stand being without her. And lived with his sister to his dying days and made another wax replica of this young woman that he died beside.
Wow. Very interesting.
I know. It's like a train wreck. I mean, the stories end up just getting fascinating.
Yes. Actually, I saw a name that I was very interested in, and I would like to get into the story of Che Guevara.
That's another one. Che is a great example of political skullduggery.
Yes.
The story behind him was, for years after his death in Bolivia, nobody knew what happened to his body. There were, the official reports that came out of Bolivia was that Bolivian Army regulars, or an Army Ranger unit, who had been advised by American troops, had wounded Guevara in a firefight in the jungles, brought him back to a schoolhouse, and executed him. What happened to his body, no one ever knew. The American advisor to the Bolivian Rangers that was on the ground at the time, his official story was that the body was thrown out into the jungle and was eaten by wild dogs. Another story that circulated was the body was cremated. And for years, this was the pervasive thought. You know, there was even rumors that the Skull and Bones Society had Guevara's skull. But the real story behind it is that there was a CIA operative that had been tracking Che for years, who had actually ran into him in Cuba during Castro's liberation of the country, who had grown up with a father who owned a car dealership and parts manufacturing plant there in Havana. And Che had basically come in and said, all right, you know, you're an imperialist spy. You either need to get out of the country or we're going to kill you or your son. So this man's father committed suicide to save his son's life. His son escapes to the United States, joins the Army, and later becomes a Army officer who worked with the CIA, is how he described it. But tracked Che for a number of years. He's the man that knew where Che was buried, because after Che was executed that night, he stole his body from the little schoolhouse and buried it out by an abandoned airstrip there in the small town that in Bolivia that Che was executed at, because he didn't want his body being used for any political motivations. Well, we flash forward to the year 2000, and just that's going on. You end up getting a kind of a three-way power grab for Che's body, because there have been rumors floating around by one of the generals in Bolivia that was there at the time, who thought he knew what the story was, that said Che's body's out there. It wasn't burned, it wasn't eaten by dogs. It exists. Then had a rough idea of where it was at. The Cubans wanted the body. The Bolivians wanted the body so they could build a museum. And turns out that our CIA operative friend wanted the truth to be told, so his body could never be used for political purposes again. And told his Che's daughter, who was still alive at the time, and I'm assuming still is, that he would go to Bolivia and locate the body on the condition that no money be made off of it. He was doing it simply for altruistic reasons. The Cubans, of course, wanted it to bring their great hero of the revolution home, and they wanted to do it either on the anniversary of his birth or on the anniversary of his death. And I can't remember which, but anyway.
To me, that sounds only right.
Yeah.
Send his bones home.
Exactly, and Castro was hot to have them. So he sent out, for a year and a half or 2 years, they dug through the Bolivian jungles. And they caught wind of the Bolivians' efforts, and there was a lot of political maneuvering from the Bolivians to, revoke dig licenses by the Cubans and other things, and some other political maneuverings to get our CIA operative friend out of the picture. But the Cubans ended up winning and finding Shay's bones. Now, they've never been DNA tested, but according to the condition of the body, or what was found of the remains, Shay was supposedly wearing some kind of rain jacket, I believe. And there was a hidden compartment in it that contained a red bag of tobacco that one of the helicopter pilots that flew him from the jungle to the little schoolhouse where he was executed remembered being on his body. So they positively confirmed that was Che Guevara by that. Of course, the Cubans didn't want the body or any of the remains being DNA tested, just in case. They didn't want the embarrassment of it. And Guevara had actually been smart enough to give hair and nail samples and dental samples or dental records before he went to the Congo in the early 60s in case he died in combat and he couldn't be identified. So anyway, but that just goes to prove the power that people will place with the dead. I mean, not only do we have religious experiences that are centered around the relics of saints, but in the secular world, the body of a political figure can be equally as powerful. And the story of Guevara, gives a great example of that you can rekindle movements and rekindle long-lost causes simply by having that touchstone of somebody's body. I mean, it's amazing.
Yes, and coming from a Asiatic background, and I do a lot of research in the Asian cultures. In some of the Asian cultures, will actually keep the dead body with their family for a few months. Yeah. In the same bed that they died in and dressed up, and it's obviously just a ritual, but I could see the connotations going back further into deeper reasons and more esoteric reasons for keeping these bones and basically the DNA that's in the bones. Have you found anything connecting that with just the esoteric side? Because everybody that has researched your work knows you're into esotericism. So what are the connections there?
Well, I think as far as the Asian connections there, it's funny that you mentioned that. I've got a chapter called The Ghost Brides of China that examines that entire dynamic. And that goes more back to, and I think it's a connection to simply ancestry. I think, within your Asian cultures, it's that connection to ancestry and to those that have gone beyond, and the belief that they can influence the events that happen to us today, the living, that give the veneration of the dead. And I'm sure throughout different cultures, throughout history, that's a pervasive thought. That, we don't want to hack off the spirit of Uncle Louie because, Louie's looking down on us from the great beyond, and, he might zap a lightning bolt on us. Or he might give me the idea for the winning lotto numbers next week.
Yeah.
So, yeah, exactly.
Is the physical connection being here, but knowing that the soul is back in the ether, that they can maybe tap in through this physical matter that's still on Earth, tapping into the celestial?
Well, exactly. I mean, I think that's the main reason there. And once again, getting in, you start flashing forward into religious reasons for those. Once you have the physical, the corporeal remains of a powerful person, either whether it be, a magician, a pope, another holy man. Their essence, as far as our eyes can see, are contained in that physical husk. And the Catholics have a great tradition of relics of saints being imbued with power, performing miracles in and of themselves, being talismans.
And a power of preservation of sorts.
Exactly. Yes. So that's I believe one of the tests of sainthood is that, or can be one of the proofs of sainthood that the body does not decay after death.
Yes.
Or does not decay. Right. So you have that, and that's once again the physical embodiment of faith. I guess that would be the easiest way to put that. Is all wrapped up in that body. So that I believe that's where all of that stems from. And our fear of having these things happen to us is mainly a religious thing too. I mean, you look at the thought of the second coming, and a lot of people believe that their bodies had to be intact once Jesus came again and raised you from the dead. Because if you were missing an arm, or your body was missing an arm, when he came back, you're going to be missing an arm then.
Is that sort of an Egyptian concept there?
Yeah, it is. I mean, it traces directly back to that. And to the Sumerians a little bit, but primarily to the Egyptians. So, I mean, but that thought worms its way into Christianity. So, you have situations where back in the Age of Enlightenment, when the medical sciences were burgeoning, and you had an explosion of the number of doctors that were being trained, you had a shortage of cadavers. And doctors had to resort to going out to graveyards and digging up fresh dead bodies to actually have cadavers to do their medical studies on. I've got a couple of examples of that in the book, too. Burke and Hare in Edinburgh were a great example of that. There was a riot at Yale University in 1824, I believe, because a young lady's body was stolen to be used as a cadaver. And the entire town in New Haven rioted to the point that the governor had to call out the local militia to stop the townspeople from burning Yale down. I mean, once again, it's fascinating stuff. And I get the response, why did you write this? All the time. And, I start talking about it, and everybody, the result is always the same. It's like, man, that is kind of interesting. And, that's exactly why I wrote it, because it does turn out to be a fascinating history.
Well, Brian, I definitely find it intriguing just for the fact that, as you just stated, it's almost unbearable at first, but when you research it, you find a lot of reason and a lot of different foresight, within these bodies and whatnot, and in the spiritual aspects, as you were getting into, and also the political. So there's many different reasons for this to take place besides necrophilia, and that was a question by After Dark in the chat room. She might have thought there was some necrophilia going on, but
I got one story with that.
Okay, let's go into that, and then after that we'll get into a quick break, and we'll be taking callers right after the break. And any questions that the listeners have, call in at 347-215-7949. 347-215-7949, and we'll be getting into a quick break. But Melchizedek, did you have any quick questions before we get into the break?
I really don't have any questions at the moment, but I do have a comment. You all spoke about the relationship between Egypt and mummification and reverence of the bodies, the vessels of the dead. Mummification is beyond Egypt. In Peru, there were 9,000-year-old mummies found. with red hair, and you can Google it and see the pictures.
Yeah, good point. Good point.
So place. It goes beyond, and that also points the finger to, as we spoke in the beginning, altered story of our past, and because our story doesn't account for that.
Yes.
In the way that we teach our children anyway in the public educational system.
You're exactly right, and I appreciate you bringing that up.
Yes, I'm glad you did, because that expanded the conversation, actually. But that's what you're going to say, Brian. Let's get into the break right after that.
I'm sorry, could you say that again?
I heard you were going to cap it off in before the break. Did you have any last thing to say?
Yeah, the last story. I'll keep this one brief since we're up against the break. But your caller that asked about the entire aspect of necrophilia, yes, it does still happen, and yes, there is a story in the book about it, about 3 young men who had tried to have a natural love for a young lady, and we'll just leave it at that. But that happened in 2004, 2003, 2004. But the biggest problem with that is not necessarily the act itself, which is, pretty bad, but the fact that it happened in Wisconsin, and the Wisconsin legislature didn't have any laws against it. Yeah, that's kind of disturbing too. And that's another trend that I saw throughout this is you get, sometimes these acts are not necessarily illegal because no one's thought to put them on the books.
Yes, and that's almost dumbfounding to not think that there is laws against this. And there's a lot of investment in graves and within the family and love that is there in that gravesite that is being tampered with, and you would think that they would have some type of law to protect that.
And in some cases there are. In some of the more famous cases, laws have come about because of it. And I think it's because, the entire aspect of death within our culture, it's not something that we talk about. A lot of people don't. And I'm talking by and large. Of course, there's always the exceptions. But, most people, they go to a funeral service, they think, man, I've got to do a will, or I've got to do this. And then 15 minutes after they leave the cemetery, I've got to get the kids from soccer practice, I've got this on my plate, and death gets shuttled to the side. And it's nothing that we want to think about because it's going to happen to all of us.
Yeah.
But it's not anything that most of us actually bring into a meaningful conversation. So once you expand that into our legislatures, and they're just like we are, so they don't talk about it either. So laws never asked to criminalize these acts until something horrible happens. And that's all I've got to say about that.
Well, as for everybody listening, we have Brian Kannard, author of Skullduggery. You can get his book at skullduggery.com. Make sure you Google his name, and you will find a lot of interesting research that this man has done. And in the next 30 minutes, we'll be getting into his interest in the Holy Grail, Knights Templar, and Freemasonry, which he is a 32nd degree Freemason. So anybody with questions pertaining to that, please call in, and we'll be getting right back after the break. Call in at 347-215-7949.
You have now come into contact with the Paranormal 101, speaking on all things paranormal, from the light to the dark, everything in the path of enlightenment.
Can you get in the chat room?
We are back live and direct. This is your host, Stephen Orion. We have our guest co-host today, Melchizedek SKS, and our special guest, Brian Kannard, author of the book Skullduggery. You can get that at skullduggery.com. Make sure you check it out and support the man. Oh, what was that?
I'm sorry. It's skullduggerythebook.com.
Okay.
Yeah, skullduggery.com is a great site for like getting old bones and stuff. And I wish I could have snagged the domain, but couldn't. But it's Skullduggery the book. Appreciate the plug.
I am very sorry for that.
That
was a mix-up on my behalf because I saw both of the sites, but then for some reason I reverted to using the shorter domain just to get it out quicker. So I would love to get into your interest in the Holy Grail, and obviously because you have a great blog on, and it's titled Grail Seekers Blog. And what's the link for that, the URL for the listeners, so they can check that out?
Yeah, it's www.grailseekers, grailseekers.blogspot.com, and it's just on Blogger. And if you do a search either on Brian Kannard or on Grail Seekers, you should be able to Google it fairly quickly. You know, it should pop up. I've got links all over the place. I've done some articles on the Unexplained Mysteries website, and I've got links there that pop up pretty quickly too. So yeah, I've been doing that for about 3-4 years now, I guess. It's been a while, but
wow.
I decided that it was that all the research that I was doing, I started collecting articles, and of course reading stuff and talking to people, and I thought, I'm all this stuff, I might as well do something with it. So I started the blog up, and it's been pretty interesting, some of the places I've been able to go to and some of the things I've been able to talk to and things I've been able to see with this. Probably the best was on October 13th, 2007, my lovely wife and I went to Paris for the 700th anniversary of the Templars' arrest. We're actually on the site where Jacques de Molay was burned at the stake at sunrise that morning. And that was pretty neat. And
wow.
Yeah, that was pretty powerful. And went to the site where the main priory was there in Paris too.
Sounds very mystical.
It was. I thought about doing this trip for years, and we'd saved up for it, and just went. And it was pretty magical. The whole thing was. I ended up getting to go to Chartres too, and I have very few mystical experiences in my life, but going to Chartres, we walked in, and I'm not a very organized religion-y kind of guy. I believe in a higher power in the way I believe in it, and I'll leave it at that. But I'm not a Catholic, and I walked into Chartres, and immediately walk in, there's, of course, the bowl of holy water. I don't know why my hand immediately went into the bowl of holy water, and I crossed myself walking into Chartres. Can't explain why. It was like a reflex. And I went to Notre Dame, and it didn't happen. I know. I've never been able to really explain that. But, yeah, I'm looking forward to going back with my wife and taking my young son Robert with us. And, it was an interesting experience.
Well, what's great about your story, Brian, is now that we've all heard your story, you can see the correlations on why you wrote the book Skullduggery, and the Masonic connections, really, and just being a Grail seeker. As we were saying before, the bones can be looked at as a Grail in some ways.
Sure, exactly. You're exactly right. There's any level of symbolic definition you can relate to the bones, to the Grail. What exactly?
Well, we could look at the Shroud of Turin, and that has nothing to do with bones, and that is so highly coveted and regarded.
Yeah, and that's recently come out within the last year, just having a Templar connection as well, too. which, you know, that blew my mind. There was Dr. Barbara Fraley, who was a Vatican researcher who found the Trial of the Templars manuscripts a few years back, made a connection between the Templars actually guarding the Shroud of Turin, and she's recently come out some information that she believes she's found some writing in 2 or 3 different languages on the Shroud, which I think that's rather convenient, but that's another story. But anyway,
yeah.
Yeah, you know.
So as for the Grail, what are your concepts on them? And please don't leave anything out. But I'm sure you could also make some Masonic connections there with your concepts.
Well, you know, and that's the funny thing about, you know, Masonry and the Grail. The Grail doesn't show up in any of the ritual. You'd think that it would somewhere, but it doesn't. I mean, not in the form that most of us think of that it is. And the Grail itself is got to be the universe's greatest metaphor, because you can take it as being a physical object. You can take it as being that chalice that chalices that were used at the Last Supper. I mean, no matter what your religious beliefs are, if you accept the fact that the Bible gives a historical account of what happened to a man named Jesus, you know, let's once again strip the religion away from it, because I don't really want to get in a religious discussion about it, but let's just say it's a historical event. Well, at a Passover feast, you would have a number of cups that would be used in a Passover feast ceremony. Well, those cups, more than likely, could still exist. I mean, you know, we've got objects that are a lot older than, you know, the 1st century AD. So
they would most likely be gold cups, right?
Not necessarily. They could be wooden cups. They could be stone cups.
But they would definitely be ceremonial.
Right. I mean, more than likely, given, you know, and there's all sorts of conjecture as to what Jesus' actual social status was. They could have been, you know, an earthenware or stone cup. They more than likely would not have been glass. That would be very rare for Jews to have used actual blown glass for a cup in the Passover ceremony. But either, like I said, either wood or stone would be likely, or possibly even some kind of metal, and possibly. You know, of course, there's a possibility that Joseph Arimathea was actually there at the Last Supper too, and the apostle texts about him go back to him being a tin merchant in England. So, you know, that's a possibility. But, you know, if you believe that it's a historical event and that his followers believe that Jesus was divine, more than likely they would have held on to those relics. And that might explain the multiple Grail cups that are found throughout the world today. I mean, there's the Chalice of Valencia. There's the one at Metz. There's the Nantos Cup. There's all sorts of these cups that are found around the world. The Antioch Chalice is another one.
Yeah.
In London for a while, which hacks me off. I've been to New York a couple times to actually see that, and it's been on display in London. But anyway, but, you know, that might give that validity. But there's also the tradition within the Grail romances of the Grail being something that's not really described. I mean, Wolfram von Esterbachen refers to it as a stone. It's referred to as a plate and others. You know, Robert de Boron was the first person that actually gave us the, you know, chalice used at the Last Supper or chalice used to catch the blood of Jesus at the crucifixion bent to it. But what I believe it is I believe it's a physical object. I believe that the Last Supper happened. I believe that one of these cups probably still exists. You know, whether there's any inherent power in it or not, I think that's up to someone that's probably up to their own faith. But I think different esoteric groups throughout the years have ascribed different symbolic meanings and their own symbolic meanings to the Grail. So you might have a group like the Priory of Zion who has ascribed the Holy Grail being the bloodline of Jesus. And that, at the same time, is equally as valid as the chalice used at the Last Supper. It's just different. Mm-hmm. And I think there are a number of those traditions out there, and that's what makes Grail study, one, so fascinating, and two, so bloody hard to do.
Mm-hmm.
Because...
So the other references to the Grail is to, it could be, each of us could be the Grail. The body is the vessel. The heart itself is the vessel that ever fills, and the Word of God is written on the heart.
Exactly.
So it could be anything, and it's just like the Ark of the Covenant. It's the spark of life. The actual physical ark is just symbolical of what's in each and every one of us, our covenant with the Most High.
Exactly. And that's it. It's the journey, too. It's the path to enlightenment that really is the Grail. It really is the Ark. I mean, you nailed it right on the head with that one.
Well, I think Mel made a perfect segue into the concepts of the Merovingian bloodline. And I've studied Dan Brown's book many different times. I watched the movie many different times. And what's your thoughts on the movie and the correctness of what took place?
Well, as far as Brown writes a good yarn. I mean, he takes most of his stuff from Holy Blood, Holy Grail, which was the Badgett and Lee book that was written back in the early 80s that really put the entire Merovingian bloodline to the forefront. I do believe there is a Priory of Zion, or that exists today. Absolutely. I believe there are probably one or two or three different Priory of Zions that exist today. Once again, like my theory of the Grail, simultaneously being multiple things, I think that holds true for different secret societies as well. You have splinter groups that happen that carry on different traditions and mutate in their own different ways. Same thing with the Priory. I think they exist. I think the Merovingian bloodline is a great possibility. I don't have a...
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, there's a good quote from a book, if I have a second, just to read this quote.
Yeah.
That kind of, and you probably will actually recognize where I'm reading this from, but the quote goes something like this, and there is meanings within meanings within meanings in this quote that I'm going to read, and it's actually 2 sentences from a paragraph, but it goes along the lines like this. Magism was the science of Abraham and Orpheus, of Confucius and Zoroaster. It was the dogmas of this science that were engraven on the tablets of stone by Enoch and Trismegistus. Moses purified and revealed them, for that is the meaning of the word revealed.
That does sound familiar. That sounds like something Albert Pike would have written. But
right on the head.
I thought that was out of Morals and Dogma.
Yeah,
I really did.
Yeah. Explains perfectly what you're saying about the Merovingian bloodlines. The Merovingian bloodlines, who is to say that it is just one bloodline, and who is to say where it has come from?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I don't have a problem with the fact that, Jesus could have had children. My wife, when we first got together, I started telling her about my interest in these kind of things, because, it's not one of those things that you want to get too far into a dating relationship and go, honey, by the way, I got this side thing that I kind of research, and, I'm a Mason, and, if you think we, sacrifice goats and do this and that, we need to talk. But, and as I got into this with her, it was kind of cool because she'd never heard of the theory before, and as I talked about it, she said, I don't have a problem with that. She said, I don't know why anybody else would either, because it would make my faith be a little bit stronger knowing that Jesus was, a person just like me, that was married, that had the same stresses, that went through the same things. And I thought, yeah, you're right. You know, what's the big problem there? So,
well, but they kind of kept a lot of that stuff from people. They rewrote the Bible so many times, and it was 300 years after his death, basically, close to 300 years, that the Nicene Council actually put the canon together that most read today. So a lot of the stuff was left out. They left out Gnostic texts. They left out a whole bunch of stuff.
Yeah,
and if a lot of people research into the Bible, like go and do your research with the Septuagint, go and do your research with different translations of the Bible, actually go into the Coptic text. And you can get books where they have the Coptic text on one page and right next to it have the translation on the next side. And you will see major, major differences in the books that are written of the same book.
Well, the reason I sort of brought up this topic of the Merovingians, because from my research, I definitely believe there is a bloodline, a Yahshuan bloodline or a Jesus bloodline, whatever we want to call it.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of information proving that he did go to Paris and procreate, I believe. And Christians do not want to believe that. Catholics do not want to believe that. So I definitely believe his blood is still on this earth through his children, who might have made a big family out there and basically branched out, went other places. And this gets to my concept of going back to the movie of Da Vinci Code. Being a researcher in the Gnostic text, as Melchizedek brought up, and I'm glad he did. He segued it perfect from the Merovingians to my concept of when I was watching the movie and looking at that PS for the Priory of Zion and my study of the Gnostic texts. When I originally seen that vision of the glass, I believe it was the glass portraits in the cathedral, and I originally saw that as Pistis Sophia until they brought up the Priory of Zion. So did you find any connections with that maybe standing for Pistis Sophia, which is the text of Mary, I believe?
Not directly, but that's one of the more prevalent theories as to what the entire connections as they run through the Gnostics to the Cathars and the Bogomils and other heretical sects back during the Middle Ages, that entire concept of the feminine divinity and the feminine wisdom being passed down, and that's the kernel that, no matter what you call it, has been, of course, hidden throughout the years. So it's very, very plausible that's what that is too. And some people would say, well, it just stands for I believe it was St. Paul or and some other mundane explanations, but
yes.
Yeah, but like any great symbol, there are multiple layers to it. And, any symbol that you look at that's a good symbol has 3 or 4 different meanings and depending on what your understanding is and how deep you want to go down the rabbit hole, so to speak. That's where you're going to get to. So if you want to stick with the mundane, that's all well and good. But the people that really want to dig, they're going to find 2 or 3 other things and 2 or 3 other layers to anything that's visually represented out there, esoterically related.
Well, I think I have a little hope for it being translated as Pistis Sophia, because that brings a little hope for the world, at least, and like you were seeing, the divine feminine return. And the cycle of divine femininity coming back to the world, because obviously it hasn't been here for the last 10,000 years, and I have a belief that it might be Pistis Sophia, just for the fact that the belief in Mary is so prevalent out there in France, in those regions, and just I believe it was a way for them to store this text somehow, but keep it a secret, of course.
Yeah.
So I definitely want to look more into the text with the Priory of Zion. And have you ever seen that movie pertaining to the Templars, and it had the kid from the Pirates of the Caribbean.
Oh, I'm trying to think which one that one was.
I can't recall the guy's name. He's very famous. Do you know which movie I'm talking about?
Orlando Bloom?
Yes, yes. It was a great movie about Knights Templars, and he was the star of that.
Oh,
movie.
Kingdom of Heaven. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
You've seen that one?
Yes, I did.
Did you get to see that one, Mel?
I have not watched it, no, but I have heard
that. It's a very great movie, and I wanted to ask Brian, what's his thoughts on the movie and the credence? Is there any credence in that movie?
Well, the movie actually compresses about 50 or 60 years worth of history into, one event.
Yes.
Yeah, with the retaking of Jerusalem. So as far as from what I know, visually speaking, it's very, very accurate. I'm not quite sure about the different portrayals of the people that were in there. Orlando Bloom's character was a historical character, but did not do all the things that are. He's kind of a footnote. He raised the army in Jerusalem there and defended the city, but nobody really knows a whole lot about him. The depiction of the Templars in the film, too, is up to what your interpretation of what the Templars actually were. I thought that they were possibly viewed as a little harsh from what I understand about them, but, once again, you're operating on what your beliefs are rather than what history you have, because there's not a whole lot of history that's there that gives you good concrete evidences.
Yeah.
But it's a visually stunning movie, and it captures the time and the feel of the Crusades very, very well. So yeah, definitely worth a rental. Some have never really been told satisfactorily, so I decided that it was probably time that hidden history come out.
Indeed. There are actually a few people that have decided, as you put in words, that hidden, quote-unquote, history come out. And as a matter of fact, history may be the incorrect word. It's a good phrase because everybody knows what his story is, but our story or Earth story or human story may be a little bit better example of that instead of what the winner writes as the story.
Exactly. And there's, I think it sounds like y'all are savvy enough to understand that there's a lot that's been left out of the Septic Chronicles.
Yes, indeed.
Exactly. Not only do we know and have studied and researched, but there are quite a few people out there that actually their lineages go back quite far into history, and actually things aren't always passed in books. There's a lot of knowledge, like the Aboriginals do, that are passed in oral tradition, and when they're passed in oral tradition, there are things that validate this oral tradition. So a lot of the things that these truth seekers look for, they're not going to find the answers to because they don't have the oral traditions. The mouthpieces that are around right now to spit this oral tradition to the masses are the ones that have received it through the generations. And it kept quiet for a long time for a certain reason. And
that's Skullduggery, 45 True Tales of Disturbing the Dead. Let's get into that and what compelled you to write a book about grave robberies.
Well, I was doing a interview with Patrice Chaplin, who's Charlie Chaplin's daughter-in-law, in November of 2007. Her publicist had gotten in touch with me to do a piece on her book, City of Secrets, where she chronicled some esoteric experiences she had in Spain when she was a young girl and what her theory of what the Holy Grail was. So I was fortunate enough to talk to her, and in doing some back research on her and on the Chaplin family, I came across a story of Charlie Chaplin's body being stolen for extortion purposes in 1977, about 3 months after he died. So I started doing a little more research on this and found out that it wasn't just Chaplin that this had happened to. I'd known about, medical grave robberies back in the 1800s, which I get into a little bit in the book. But there are a ton of famous people and not so famous people that have had their bodies stolen for all sorts of purposes. But the stories were really fascinating because they turn into a hidden history. I mean, the way people's lives are chronicled, they end with the grave. And most biographies you pick up of Groucho Marx or Chaplin or Thomas Paine end with him dying. Well, that's not the end of these people's stories. They continue on after the grave. And some of these stories have become folklore over the years. And
one thing that a lot of these truth seekers don't realize, and I keep putting them in a group called truth seekers, it's just the best way I can categorize a lot of people that research stuff, is they seem to think that the Illuminati are all Freemasons, and they're missing a big point in the message. All Freemasons are not Illuminatis. All Freemasons are not out to get everybody. A lot of the Freemasons know not what the material is that they even read.
It's certainly true. There's a lot of guys out there that, they are members of a lodge to be part of a tradition, and they want to be part of a tradition, and that's where Masonry ends for them. They're part of a fraternity, and that's great. I mean, we do a lot of good work. And then there's other guys like me that are out there that are interested more in understanding what the rules and the history are. And, we're all admonished as Masons to make out of Masonry what we will. So, what's good enough for one guy, it might not be good enough for the other, or might not be their end purpose. So I agree with you. And as far as, us being part of the Illuminati or anything, if anybody had sat in on one of our building committees or trying to get a lodge picnic together, y'all would know that there's definitely somebody out there that can pull the strings of the world better than us. Getting one of those together is, hard enough.
It sounds quite strange when I say this, but I seem to think this a lot of times when I watch like YouTube videos or I hear these people talk like they know exactly what's going on. It's almost as if they're bringing a...
Let's start off with maybe a quick bio, and then from there we'll get right into your book.
Okay. Well, about 15 years ago, when I was back in college, I was taking a Western Civilization class, and we got to the Crusades, and I came across a short, very, very short reference to the Knights Templar that mentioned that they had owned half of the farmable land in Europe, and they had developed the banking system and had agents in every royal court in Europe at the time, and there was about a pair of, just 2 or 3 lines devoted to them. So I started thinking, wait a minute, there should be a little bit more on these guys than that. So I started doing research into the Templars and kind of started a life path on investigations into the esoteric and into historical mystery in general. I became as part of my research, I found Freemasonry, became a Mason, and had achieved the 32nd degree of the Scottish Rite. And about in 2006, I started chronicling some of my investigations and some things in a blog and website called Grail Seekers, which can be found at on Blogger and at www.grailseekers.com.
Yeah.
And was working a corporate job for 11 years, and this past September I decided to give it all up and do what I enjoy doing, which is writing and investigating, and Skullduggery is my first book. Hopefully one of many. So, kind of a big scary leap there, but I'm doing what I love. I hate being miserable, so here I am.
Exactly. And I believe that is one of the purposes of life, is to live your life doing what you love and doing what you love as a career, of course.
Amen.
Yes, sir.
It takes a little while to figure that out. It takes a little faith to do it, but I can't describe how much happier I am now doing what I'm doing now. So I appreciate you having me on tonight, too.
Oh, anytime, because I actually heard your shows with Rick Osmond, who I have been blessed to have conversations with.
Oh, yeah, Rick is
a very good man. Yes, I heard your shows on there, and I was fascinated, to say the least. And I wanted to bring a few of my friends on. We have a few of my guests co-hosts to bring on. I have my friend Melchizedek on the line, I think. Let me see if this... Yes, Melchizedek, are you there?
How you doing, Brother Stephen?
I am doing swell, brother. How you doing, Melchizedek?
I'm doing all right. Usually not off on Sunday nights, but I had a grandmother pass away. Today was viewing, tomorrow's the funeral, so I had a couple days off.
Sorry to hear about that, but wow, it's almost a blessing in disguise for the show, at least. But I'm very sorry to hear about that, man.
It's all right.
So, get to see the description on the showcase here, Mel?
Yes, indeed.
Actually, Brian, I think Melchizedek would be a perfect person to help co-host the show today, and I think I'm blessed to have him aboard because he is very informative and definitely has studied the Freemasons and the Templars and the ancient history. But until we get to that, let's dive right into your book.